The good news is we have more. The bad news is you have to sit down. So we got to round up whoever's on the back row. You're in charge of the people outside. Just round them up. We need to keep on going. So do I have some sense from anybody back there about people coming in? You might tell them. We need one of those chime things. Like, Cindy, will you just sort of like tell them time to go or time to come in? Thank you, Cindy. Okay, we're going to keep on going. The fabulous will continue. So I am delighted to introduce to you all Tina Campanella, who flew in from Washington, D.C. to help us. Tina is the Chief Executive Officer of an organization called Quality Trust for People with Disabilities. Tina and I knew each other, had met briefly when I was in D.C. She has over 35 years' experience working with and on behalf of children and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. She's directed residential and organizational development strategies for human service agencies throughout the U.S. and abroad. She's a leader in her field with areas of expertise in systems change, quality management and improvement, disability policies, and services development. So Quality Trust, and this is how we know each other, operates the National Resource Center for Supported Decision Making, which was a new resource center that we funded during my time at ACO. They work with people with disabilities, older adults, professionals, providers, advocates, government agencies to help reform guardianship laws. And they also help us kind of figure out how we implement supported decision making as a practice, that it goes from a concept to something that's accepted as practice. Are you going to talk a little bit about the background of Quality Trust at all? Because will you talk a little bit about the end? Okay, yep. I'll have her give you some background about Quality Trust and kind of where they came from in this world. Thank you. Tina will talk to us about supported decision making. Tina, I may move so I can see the slides from the front.
No worries.
Take it away. You've got a lavalier, I think, so I'll go sit down. So please help me welcome Tina Campanella.
Thank you very much, and I'm very honored to be here and have this opportunity to talk with you today. I wanted to thank Kathy in particular, as she said, for her leadership on the topic of supported decision making and many others that kind of bridge the aging and disability community. And as I listened to the panel, I thought I wanted to thank them for such a great setup. I shared with Kathy, I've never seen anything go wrong when you lead with stories that come directly from people and people's real experience. And the other thing that I was just struck by and reinforced in terms of my own belief system by listening to the folks who were up here is that in the end, we're all just people. And to the extent that we can ground ourselves in that idea, we're better off. But there's a lot of complexity in our world that kind of drags us away from that thought. And in fact, that is what I get to talk to you a little bit about today. Again, my experience is people with disabilities, but the work we're doing through the National Resource Center is really framing the conversation around how decisions get made in people's lives for both people with disabilities and people who are aging. So as I thought about addressing a group of folks who really think more about the aging, what I thought is it would be useful if we could frame some questions. So these three questions came to mind. First of all, think about if any of your life decisions were called into question by people who are close to you. Think about if the people you trusted most began to kind of ask some real questions about, the goodness, if you will, of your decision making. Or if they started collecting facts as evidence to prove that their opinion of your decision-making was not good and that you were losing capacity in some way. Or that because of whatever happened in your life circumstances, things like your health or your finances or your safety became the dominant theme that everybody talked about and used as a way to make decisions for you. What would that mean how would that change what happens in your life? This is often the reality that people with disabilities face all the time, and that disability is kind of the thing that people use as the filter to see who, to kind of think about what needs to happen in people's lives. And unfortunately, for many people as they age who experience health issues, that again becomes the issue that is used as a filter to think about, what happens. In my own life, and many of us, now that we're at this life stage, have stories about personal. For me, it was my dad, and who lived into his 80s and was Italian. My last name's Campanella. It's my birth name. He was fiercely independent. He was your quintessential first-generation Italian American. And, for him, the issue of aging was slowly watching all of his capabilities kind of be stripped away by the deterioration of his physical capability. He was supported by 3 loving children who had 3 different levels of capacity and who are 3 very different individuals in personality. My brother, who's the oldest, my mother had decided would be the one in charge because he was the oldest and she was a guy, right? My sister, who's the middle one, was, the kind of flaky one, so she kind of floated in and out and has opinions but doesn't necessarily work through on them because she's the middle child. And then me, I come from a healthcare industry. But I was not chosen as the one to be in charge, so I was kind of on the sidelines, kind of waiting to clean up the mess. And in fact, there was a mess because the one thing that my brother, who is a very kind of straightforward problem-solving kind of guy, thought is if the doctor says it, you do it. That's how he lives his life, is the doctor says it, you do it. Well, he would take my father to the doctor, and the doctor would say this, and my father would nod his head, and then they would go home, and my father wouldn't do it. Right? And so they were locked in this conflict around, my brother was now filtering my father through this health lens that the doctor was the one in charge. And if he was going to live his life, it should be through the lens of whatever the doctor says you should do, because you've now got this health complication. And it wasn't until things got really bad and I came into the picture that we began to then think about, okay, what is it that is causing Daddy not to want to do what the doctor's doing? And there were some very specific reasons behind why he didn't want to do what he was doing. And it was coupled by, given his age and his practice with the health industry, that he didn't really think it was appropriate to question the doctor. So if he was going to get answers to the questions in his mind, he had to have a translator. And it wasn't because he couldn't speak. It was because culturally and experientially, if you will, he didn't have the resources in order to manage this on his own. He had perfect capacity. He was clear until the end. But he wasn't necessarily prepared through life experience to handle these sorts of things. But he wasn't going to just do what the doctor said. So it puts us into an interesting dilemma. I use as another example kind of how things can really go wrong. Lillian and Dino Palermo, I'm not sure if anybody saw this. It was 2015. It was in the New York Times. And essentially, Lillian and Dino did everything right. They had conversations. They had the powers of attorney in place. They had made all the preparation. And then Lillian experienced dementia, and her care became more than Dino could provide at home. And so Lillian eventually entered this nursing home, which you see a picture of Dino and Lillian here, because Dino visited her every day. He brought her food. He took care of, a lot of the things that you typically would expect the nursing home to take care of. He just couldn't do it at home by himself. And in fact, he had the power of attorney over finances. And for this family, what happened is Dino began to question some of the charges the nursing home was making. And instead of continuing to work with Dino as the power of attorney and agent on behalf of Lillian, the nursing home decided that filing for guardianship would be a much more expedient way to get paid. And so they did, and in fact, the lawyer for the nursing home was quoted saying that guardianship was a perfectly legitimate way to get paid and to handle these disputes, if you will. So again, you see, we are all here at the crossroads of thinking about what does this mean for us, how we think about decision making, how the law works. Our system is fairly broken at this point because I think the larger picture of putting all of these pieces together has not been done by a lot of folks. I'm privileged to be speaking to people who care about these issues, who are drawn to making better decisions. But a lot of times I'm not speaking to people like that. I'm speaking to people who want to oversimplify it in the wrong way. Now, what is supported decision-making? Let's think about us. Supported decision-making as an idea is very simple. It's about making available to anyone who needs support in their decision-making processes the kinds of support that everyone else gets. Only most of us manage that on our own without any kind of structural assistance. So if we're coming up to a decision that we have in our minds feel comfortable making, we may do a little internet search, we may do a little reading, or we may not. We may have the experience in our background that just allows us to go ahead and make that decision. Or if we come across a decision that has a little bit more complexity and is a little bit more foreign to us, fill in the blank. It may be your finances, it may be buying a car, it may be buying a house, something with a little bit more complexity. We may go ahead and consult professionals, or we may go ahead and consult friends and family members, or people within our extended network of relationships who have more experience than us or expertise. And that's an perfectly appropriate way to make decisions. But for people in structural settings and institutional settings in particular, those sorts of supports are not necessarily acknowledged as part of the formal support process. Okay? You think about the last time you were in a hospital and you were given information and asked to consent about, your procedure or whatever was happening to you. How was that process? How much information was given to you, and how much were you just handed the papers and asked to read them and sign them? My husband and I no longer go to appointments. I've been listening to these. My husband and I no longer go to appointments without each other. We've had too many hospitalizations, and we are firmly grounded in the fact that now, what one of our panelists says, when you go to the doctors, you're being the subject of it. You need someone else sitting there to be eyes and ears, because otherwise you walk away. Now, there's nobody at this point questioning my capacity. It's not an issue of whether or not I have the ability to make the decisions. It's what other factors or variables might impinge on those abilities or sort of interact with those abilities in a not so positive way. All right? So supported decision-making is really just in the end, acknowledging that each person should be in charge of their destiny. And that regardless of what circumstances surround that person in any given time, our goal should be to customize the support in order to enable them to remain in charge. I love the title that you gave me. How do you stay the course? How do you remain in charge? Again, with my dad, again, I'll go back to that situation. With my dad, it was a lot of accommodation. It was a lot of helping him understand. It was a lot of conversation before we got to the doctor and asking him his permission if I could ask the doctor the questions he was not happy to ask, right? And letting him know I didn't have any compunction whatsoever to ask those questions. And he could be physically present. He could listen to the answers. And he could either decide to ask more questions, or we could then go home and have the conversation afterwards and then go back to the doctor. Because we were going to the doctor a lot anyway. So it didn't matter if we got them all asked the first time. It was a process. And we had to, first of all, recognize that it was a process that had to be driven by whatever his needs were. And secondly, a process that was going to kind of play out over time. Because there was no urgency to get this done right away. Right? And if, for some reason, any one of his children had been given the authority to make those decisions for him, it wouldn't have necessarily changed the circumstances for him, right? Because he still wouldn't have been happy, right? And it might have caused some other circumstances to emerge that may or may not have been acknowledged as related to the first circumstance of not having listened to him, not having taken the time to understand his situation, and then to accommodate to that situation with an array of supports. All right? So supported decision-making in its concept is simple. In its implementation is where it becomes a little sticky. Now, as of February of this year, we're on a third year of that grant cycle that Kathy talked about, third of 5, and we have been working, again, in the disability and the aging field. And we have noticed that the folks in the disability community have more or less embraced this a little bit more quickly, although their challenges are around kind of the issue of cognitive assessment. So when there's an IQ score that's a little limited, it throws people. As you heard from, again, our panelists, those things don't necessarily go hand in hand. We have a lot of people who may not test well, who have a lot to say and can teach us a lot. So we have to be aware of that. On the flip side, the issues with the aging haven't gone as quickly. Now, those folks are very interested in it, and as I point out in this slide, they see it as very consistent with the Older Americans Act and the kinds of things in principle that we should be supporting. Where it begins to fall apart is when we look at what the realities and the circumstances are for people who are aging. And the reality is that many people are losing trusted people in their networks. So by the time people get to a point at which their support for decision making is greater, their supporters are not greater, right? So you're reliant on your kids and not your friends, or maybe you've lost your spouse, or maybe you've actually lost connection with your neighbors and those sorts of things. So that's a problem, because that's a big part of, if you heard me talk about the definition of supported decision-making, getting good support. Maybe, that is going to set you up for a whole set of lowered or different expectations based on what society thinks about the capabilities of people who are older. So that's your ageism and age bias. There's a lot of bad information out there about what happens when you age. A lot of people say it's your second childhood, right? And they believe that, right? I don't intend to go into another childhood. I am thrilled to be aging because it's not my childhood, and I'm so much smarter now. And if anybody ever tried to be I wasn't really easy to mother when I was a child. I think I'd be even more difficult to mother now as an adult who has lots of life experience. So you think about all the ways in which ageism plays out. Those are expectations that can impact how people with how people who are aging get support for and respect for their decisions. That also puts people, because of these limited networks and support on that, at risk of undue influence. That undue influence is something that people are really worried about when it comes to talking about how we support people who are sick and older in really retaining control. Because what do we do if they make bad decisions? And what do we do if someone is taking advantage of them? However, what I would also say is that if we look at some of our systems of protection, they actually eliminate control, but they also isolate people and put them at a different kind of a different kind of risk, and potentially a greater risk of control by the people who are the quote-unquote protectors. Right? And we're back to the whole notion of one or two elements of their life, health, safety, or finances, may become a defining feature of how their life gets organized. And finally, I have to throw in here that we did talk a little bit about institutions, but when we talk about institutions, and by that I mean nursing homes, hospitals, the courts, because it's any kind of structure that is organized, all of these things are risk averse. So they really, when making decisions, often take or look for the safest road. And that is potentially a problem for any one of us in this room as we begin to try and navigate our way through the second half of our life that may involve the need for a lot of greater supports. So these were the things that everybody could agree on. As a result of this symposium where we brought all these aging folks together to have this conversation, the thing that came out of this was, what do we do to go forward? We need a lot more discussion and education, a lot more conversation. Some of what I heard last night, again, the conversation. So what do we have to have conversations about? That's what I'm going to talk to you about. These next items are not going to be, this is what to do. This is what we should be thinking about. Okay, so this will go a little faster here. The first thing is, all decisions are personal. And we can never understand people's decisions unless we do the deep dive. People's behavior, and we're really at risk of this in the disability community, we look at people's behavior and we try and interpret it without necessarily doing the hard work over time to understand it. Right? And it's a problem. So why my father wasn't taking that pill is because he liked an evening scotch. The doctor would have preferred him not to drink the scotch. My father wasn't going to do that. So therefore, he adjusted the timing of his medication on his own. So the solution was, Daddy, we need to tell the doctor that you intend to drink a scotch. And you're not going to, and so we had that conversation. So let's ask the doctor when we take the pill. Not you decide when we take the pill, because I can't decide when we take the pill. So it may be something that's simple, but unless we do the deep dive, we won't understand. Other things to think. First of all, human decision-making as a whole. And again, this is where I got very nervous talking to bioethics, because all the groups I talk to, you guys are the ones who actually have thought about decision-making. The majority of decision makers out there, social workers, psychologists, direct support workers, all the other people, they haven't thought about decisions. They haven't looked at decision science. They're kind of doing one of these things. She looks like she can make a decision. She doesn't. I think we need to give her help or question her decision separately. The same thing we heard up here from Mr. Flowers. Some people may be doing it based on certain variables. Others may be doing it on other variables. There's all kinds of things that can influence how people make decisions. Cultural, personal beliefs, history, experience, relationships. All of these things enter into the mix, right? So decision making, as you know, is not a thing. And you also know that the things such as brain science and decision science are advancing all the time. So that if you're studying these things, you know how to improve and how to think better about decisions. But for the public at large, and again, many people who work our systems, this is all news to them. They are not reading the studies. And until we can get some of this infused into how our systems work, they will remain broken. Okay? So the critical questions that we need to answer or we need to struggle with, because the answers aren't going to come quickly, are around capacity, what do supports look like, and what practical steps can be taken to help. And for this, I'm going to focus on some big picture issues. So in the first one, it's capacity itself. So one of the big pitfalls here with capacity is we look at capacity as a fixed item. Capacity is not fixed. Capacity is relative. Capacity fluctuates over time. Capacity may have to be judged in relationship to an activity, an event, a decision. Okay? So the idea that we can measure capacity is probably a big misnomer. Right? Capacity is not a thing. What we really see with capacity is that we need to think about how we can make the most of people's abilities. So the capacity is a useful idea to think about what people have done and where we can start to build on. So again, I knew my father could think, so therefore I had to figure out how to make him a better decision maker. I'm just going to use him again throughout this because it's the one I know the best. Another one of his issues is he had congestive heart failure. And as healthcare professionals, had congestive heart failure can be fluid buildup around the heart that causes you to have difficulty breathing. Well, he was an ex-smoker, and he thought if he had difficulty breathing, it must be the edema, right? He didn't connect it to too many scotches that were leading to putting off his fluids, that were leading to fluid buildup, that led to that. And that was not a connection. Until I was able to help him develop a chart, because he's got the control issues, remember. Develop a chart where he could weigh himself on a regular basis. Because he was into that, because he could do that. It was something he could control, and as with dwindling capacity, control was an issue. He would weigh himself, and he could understand that he would not gain 5 pounds in one day based on food, because he wasn't eating that much. So it made sense to him at that point that if he gained 5 pounds in one day, this was something we needed to do something about and not just let it go. Because what would happen next are breathing problems if we didn't get the fluid balance adjusted. So we really have to think about capacity as people being potentially able to make decisions. And in, again, our work in disabilities, we presume capacity all the time. In fact, it is what we challenge ourselves to do. It is not easy to presume capacity, but it is fundamental to presume capacity. Because if we don't presume capacity, we won't go looking for it. And we won't find the starting place, or what I like to call the thread, which we can then pull and move forward with. Another thing to think about is autonomy and control, and I think the people that are going to talk to you next will talk more about this in detail. But autonomy and control is the fundamental element to me in supported decision making, because it positions the person as for whom the decision has to be made as in the driver's seat. And however we make that happen is what we have to happen. You notice this doesn't say independence, because none of us live independently. We're all interdependent. And that's a good thing. It's not really a goal. It used to be something we strived for on behalf of people with disabilities. We've backed off on that and traded it off for autonomy, because autonomy with it has the acknowledgement that your you're in the driver's seat, if you will. And there are many ways to be in the driver's seat. And that's the critical element that we need to keep in mind. A third thing to think about is this notion of dignity. And many people mix up dignity and respect. I'm actually going to talk about them separately because I think dignity is really the reason why you would presume capacity, because you recognize that every living being has some inherent value and worth. And if I recognize that factor, I am therefore obligated to support you in that way. And that requires recognizing that each identity is unique. And what we have to do is really preserve that identity over time. I'll use a separate example now. A parallel activity that I'm engaged in is helping people with disabilities who've lived in an institutional setting for a very long time move to community settings because the place they're living eventually is going to close, and sooner, not later. Some of these people have actually lived in this institution for many years, like 40, 50 years. And one of the things that is most difficult about about the situation is getting those institutions to recognize people as not just the people they are today, but as the people with a whole history of life experiences that has led them to the path that they are today. And I think that parallel for anybody who's aging is a critical one, because we may find ourselves in a nursing home being supported to deal with our dementia at any given point, but we are not dementia at that point. We are still the people who have lived a life. And that acknowledgement, that honoring of that life lived until this point is the way in which we will convey dignity to that person. I thought it also useful to highlight indignity here. And the definition that I found for indignity was degradation, debasement, and humiliation. And I think if we can keep those parallels in our mind, we then are going to be much better in terms of supporting people to remain in control throughout their lifetime, regardless of the circumstances. We know this is the right thing to do, not only from our experience, but also from science. And so there are studies out there, and there probably need to be lots more. But what we know is that when people remain in control, they in fact live better and happier lives. And in our work, what we've seen is when people are in control, they're much better at accepting the circumstances of their situation. So, for people, again, like my dad who were aging, he wasn't happy about losing capacity, but he understood it. And to the extent he could be accommodated to retain some shred of control and to be supported in his own dignity, if you will, then he was happier. He wasn't, again, happy. He was happier and accepted some of those limitations a lot more gracefully. People have talked a lot about relationships. And relationships are critical. And as we think about how this works, we've really got to get into the complexity of relationships, because they can work in a positive or negative way. We hear a lot of stories about people getting undue influence from their family. That rogue daughter that comes in and decides that she's going to be the power of attorney and she's going to decide whatever happens, and starts spending the money or starts doing some things unbeknownst to the rest of the family, right? So there are conversations here, and there's dynamics that relate to family that are not easily dealt with, right? You've got the issue of paid versus unpaid people, right? So, again, in the disability world, we think unpaid people are much better than paid people, but it's not that simple. You've got paid people who can be Mother Teresa, and you've got unpaid people who can be the burglar, be the one that really is influencing people in a negative way. So we've got to think about, how do we balance out, the roles of different people in the lives of people who are aging, so that we've got the right mix. And what we do know from the data we do have is that the more people that are involved in people's lives, the greater likelihood that they are going to be free from neglect, abuse, and other bad things happening to them. Why, you say? Because somebody is likely to raise their hand and say, stop. Somebody is likely to assist the person. And oh, by the way, the other thing we know is if people are empowered to stay in control and are respected and know their voice will be heard, they're more likely to stand up. So relationships will play a big role in this. And then again, I'm going to throw in respect as more or less the last one. Respect it's really culturally grounded, if you will. Respect is not something that is just a personal item, but it does. We do define it differently based on where we come from, what our life experiences are, what we've had, and it's very often people, when you ask them if they're respected, they'll be able to tell you yes or no, but they won't necessarily be able to define respect. So respect is something that we need to really work at understanding on a person-by-person basis, because it, in the end, is hard to define, but it's deeply felt if it's not given, right? So honor and respect for people in the decision-making process is going to be a critical element. Now, decision-making isn't a problem when we deal with all the little things. It's when we get to the big things, right? So it's about where people live, where they work, health management, relationships, money, connections in the community, and what they do. So this is where the resources that we have at our fingertips are really critical. On top of my list, I have communication. And again, I'm often giving this talk to people in the disability world. And the issues as they play out as communication for people with disabilities kind of play out one way, but I am firmly convinced, as Kathy is, that the issue is still the same. It's about communication. Do we have good communication? Do we know why the person does what they do? Do we know what their wishes are? Have we had the conversations? Because again, what we know is if we haven't had the conversations when people are well, when issues are not at our face, then it's going to be almost impossible to have those conversations when things go bad. Right? So right now I'm dealing with two different situations in my extended network. One is my husband's first cousin who's dying, whose family is just in the throes of helping her die. She's in hospice. But the situation's a mess because they haven't had the conversation. So they're just muddling through and trying to figure out what the best thing to do is, because at this point she's no longer talking. And they really have nothing to guide their decision making. And the other is an old family friend, again, whose situation, I don't know the details of it, but it must have hit some critical variable, and the son took control. Mom and dad moved from where they were living. They're selling their house. They're living in assisted living. And of course, I only visit mom and dad, and I know mom and dad aren't happy, but they're not going to rock the boat. And they can't have the conversation now. We can't help. All the well-educated people in the world, if they haven't had the conversation, it's too late at a certain point, or it may be too late for most people. There's all sorts of things, obviously, lots of documentations, the wishes, the last, why can't I call it living wills and those sorts of things that we can put into place. And we can use some non-traditional tools to help work through these family issues. But most importantly, I think we can't turn away from them. We really have to face on what these issues are and not hide. Because, again, communication and putting in writing or putting as a foundation the kinds of things we need to have in order to support decision making is critical. The earlier, the better, right? So the resources that you know well probably of the Conversation Project and the 5 Wishes are critical resources, and from our experience so far, really are probably the thing that you can most build on. In addition, I think there has to be lots more conversation about healthy relationships, about how do we support this? How do we talk about respect and boundaries? How do we help families that we are involved with really work through the issues? I know we're involved in a lot of lifespan issues. So we see people with disabilities from the earliest time through the end of life. And there's a lot of stuff that families have to work through, and none the least with, again, disabilities, the fact that it would be hard to be controlling of your family member and supportive of your family member at the same time. It's not impossible, but it's hard. It's hard to be in charge of and in support of at the same time. Again, not impossible, but hard. So we really need to think about how we do this and think about planning for disagreement before the disagreement happens. Think about planning for things going badly before things go badly. And then we have the foundation for a better process. I also felt it was important to say just a few words about shared versus supported decision making, because there's a long tradition about shared decision making out there. And it comes from the healthcare field. And there's lots of good things about it. So there's lots of parallels between shared and support. However, think about it. Just the word means shared is there's 2 locus of power, right? So the person's acknowledged as the expert in their own life, but the healthcare professional or the partner in decision making is also acknowledged as an expert. And those 2 things coexist. Supported decision making is not that. Supported decision making is the person is in charge, right? It doesn't diminish my expertise as someone is having over 35 years of experience in the field of disabilities. It doesn't diminish it. What it means is that in the end, it's their life, right? And I'm not sharing the decision making. I'm informing the decision making. I'm going to do whatever it takes for me to help that person understand the challenge that they face. And in the end, if they choose to go that way, when I think they should go this way, I'll tell them, but it's their choice, because it's their life. And in the end, they have to live it. So it's a really important thing. I think there's a lot of resources tied to shared decision making that I think have a lot of value for us. But I think also that supported decision making is really a different animal. And this is where, just as a wrap up, I'll tell you again, we've worked through these issues, again, for people with disabilities, mostly, but from beginning to end of life. And end of life, again, my organization, we're an independent advocacy organization that was created out of a lawsuit, a long-standing lawsuit that was only settled this past January. And we've gotten all the tough issues, when people don't know what to do, they kind of refer them to Quality Trust and say, you kind of take the lead on this. Because, again, the institutions, the government, the providers institutions, the healthcare institutions, they're risk averse, right? And so having someone who would focus in on just the person and try and navigate through all of those different factions and pressures would be critical. And that's what we've done. And again, we've taken on the National Resource Center. From a national perspective, we are just seeding things throughout the country, because when it comes to guardianship and other laws, everything's local. So what has to be done in Kansas is going to be different than what has to be done in Arizona or Maine or Delaware or DC. And it has to be done by the people on a local level. So really our job as the National Resource Center is to stimulate the conversation. And I hope that what I have done today is to give you some things to think about. How that impacts your practice. How do we integrate these ideas into assisting people to remain in control of their lives throughout their lives and to the end of their life? Because that in and of itself is probably one of the most honorable and important goals and tasks that we can accomplish. So again, thank you, Kathy. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me and having me share some time with you.
Shall we see if anybody has one or two burning questions?
Okay.
Myra, yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, Myra's not bashful, so.
Okay.
I'm Myra Christopher.
She's the founder of the center.
And I wanted to comment, make a suggestion, and challenge you.
Okay.
So in the very beginning, when you had your slide up talking about what supported decision-making is, you had a statement that it starts with acknowledging that the person with disability and older adults have the right to make their own decisions. You kind of come back to it later, but I would ask that you amend that slide and change it to they have the capacity and the right to make their own decision. We, here in Kansas City, on the Missouri side, we have public administrators. And I don't know, in the 90s, we got a new administrator. We had a pretty bad situation, a young man who was very much an advocate for those he served. He had 1,400 ward protectees to make decisions for. So he came to us and said, can you help us figure this out? And so we talked about a lot of the things that you have worked on and ultimately did a project we call Bridge. I don't even remember what the acronym stands for now, but we asked him, this was Frank Murphy, some of you know Frank, I don't think so.
We asked him what his assumptions were. How many of his clients did he assume had capacity to make decisions for themselves? And he said, oh, probably 15, 20%. So over several years of working with him on this project, what we learned was the numbers were inverted. In fact, about 80% of his ward protectees had capacity to make decisions if they were supported to express their autonomy and their goals and values. So I would ask you to make that change. You commented a couple of times that if people haven't made advance directives, if they haven't talked with their family, you know, it's kind of, you're just screwed and you got to muddle through. I'm a huge proponent of advanced care planning. But I don't think you have to muddle through, because even in the absence of those documents, and I think we place way too much emphasis on those pieces of paper and gold seals and all that malarkey, that person has a history. And so those around that person, when I get these calls, and people at the center always get these calls, and many of you do too, the first thing I do is say, tell me about your loved one. And they begin to tell the story to recreate that person's narrative. And then as we proceed and involve others in the conversation, I say, okay, so you're going to have to write the last chapter here, but you have to do that in a way that it honors and respects that person and what they have created to thus far. The other thing I want to challenge you about, and I get it, and I've made the same argument about supported versus shared decision making. It denies the moral agency of the healthcare provider if you say, in the end, it's the patient's choice. And I agree with you that your locus of concern is generally in the patient. And if you ask healthcare professionals, tell me who the stakeholders are here, prioritize them, they have been socialized and conditioned to always say it's the patient. It's just not true.
Right.
I mean, there are many times it's not true, and there's sometimes it should not be true. So I would challenge you to go back and think and maybe engage with others here who are healthcare professionals, because they are actors in these situations, and it's not just that person's life that will be impacted. Their lives will be impacted too. And so there's this real tension, and I think we've got to do, all of us have got to do more work on that.
Cool. So just a couple things. Easy to do the capacity thing, and it's a great point. When I leave here, I'm going to go to the National Guardianship Association. I was really struggling with what to include in here and what not to include. But I'm really very much a supporter of the best practices that are promoted by the National Guardianship, of recognizing that everybody has something to offer, even if they're under guardianship. So its capacity exists in everybody, and again, the presumed capacity, I'll keep that a little tighter. The second thing is that I think you're absolutely right, that I should not make it sound like you're quote-unquote screwed, because there's always a pathway to go forward. And I think it just makes it more difficult. So, yeah, I think the emotional impact of it all at that point, when people have already made decisions and their ability to take in is diminished. So again, that is a fabulous qualification in terms of, what is possible. And then finally, the whole notion of the moral authority of a professional in this. I didn't. Okay. Agency.
I said agency.
Okay, I'm sorry. I would love to think more about that and think more deeply about that. I absolutely believe that as any kind of professional touching any person, that it is a responsibility that we have to make sure people have access to all the information. And then, of course, we have certain responsibilities not to participate in certain choices that people may want to pursue, right? We can't support every choice that people make, because some of them are actually illegal. I think thinking more deeply about what our role is and where it starts and ends would be a great outcome.
And I think one of the real problems that the bioethics community has contributed to is focusing so much on autonomy as though it is the trump card. And again, often it should be the trump card. But if we think about, and you did a nice job of talking about culture and how that impacts these matters, there are a lot of cultures that autonomy is not the major concern. It's a more communitarian approach.
Yep.
And so I think those of us in bioethics have to do a lot more thinking about this as well, because you've got to balance these values here and respect the culture and beliefs of others who may not hold your views of the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's simple, yet it's complicated. Well, the idea is simple, but when not to put it in, putting it in action is very complicated.
All right, I'm going to help you all take a break. Now, please help me thank Tina for coming, for her thoughts, for helping us this morning. Thank you, Tina. There's a magic clock on the back of the wall that says it's 5 to 11. Can we do 10-minute breaks and come back?